You found the skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there, YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. When last we left off, we were being told that because some dinosaurs aren't birds, that somehow means that birds aren't dinosaurs? As if the fact that hedgehogs aren't whales means that whales aren't mammals. Also, Clarey seemed to be confused as to the number of hips tetrapods have, thinking that apparently there are back hips, which implies front hips, which, isn't real. Maybe he just misspoke, but then again, it's not like he was any more coherent when he was pretending that feathers were actually just frayed skin collagen. I'm not sure where he's going next, so let's find out together, shall we?
Well, I'm going to stop you for a second.
Okay.
We're going to do a random science question of the day.
Okay.
Are you ready?
I'm always trying to be ready.
You'll try to be ready.
I suppose I too will be ready and will answer the question, but before I do, I have to say that I very much doubt that this is random. I strongly suspect that these are simply not disclosed to the guest beforehand, but are in fact crafted intentionally by whatever team or person is in charge of the content for these podcasts.
I'm trying to be ready.
If we, as in we the human race, could bring back one type of dinosaur, which would you choose?
That is not a science question. That does not require any knowledge of science. But anyway, my answer would probably be the moa. Sure, it's not as Jurassic Park inspired as Stegosaurus or Tyrannosaurus or Burriolestes. But here's the thing. The ecosystems those animals evolved in are gone now. They would not have a role in the world apart from curiosities for humans to gawk at. Moas, on the other hand, could still fit easily into the ecosystem of New Zealand. Sure, it would probably require some population regulation from humans in the form of culling, since I don't get to also bring back their natural predators, Haast's eagle. But I think returning New Zealand to a condition closer to how it existed for millions of years before humans showed up, sometime early in the second millennium, would be pretty cool. Also, while moas might not be T-Rex, I have heard a creationist call a mummified moa foot a dinosaur foot, which is both ironic and technically true.
Stegosaurus.
Why?
Because I don't think they would eat me.
They might impale you, though. That seems bad. If the major criterion is safety if encountering the animal in person, there are many safer dinosaurs. The aforementioned Burriolestes is an example. The thing is not even 40 centimeters tall. Sure, it was a predator, but it was probably eating invertebrates like gastropods and insects. Calindrodromeus is about the same size and herbivorous, so maybe that's a better option. It was also fuzzy with a cool scaly tail.
That's it? That's your blanket answer?
And they probably weren't too fast because they had big, long legs in the back, about twice as long as the front legs.
Which is weird, isn't it? Not many quadrupeds are so hind limb dominant. In fact, it really only makes sense when you realize that dinosaurs are all basically bipedal. Stegosaurus is part of a clade called Thyreophora. That includes ankylosaurs as well as stegosaurs. One of the earliest thyreophorans was Scutellosaurus, and it was bipedal. Stegosaurus has that odd body shape specifically because of its evolutionary history.
They could turn sideways and look really big because they like that fan shape to their body, and but they have very, very small teeth in the front, and they probably were very docile compared to a lot of dinosaurs.
Each year, humans and bison interact, and in some of those cases, the bisons attack the humans. Generally, this is provoked, although often unintentionally, by the human. Do you think those humans are being bitten? No, they're not. You see, a bison, like a Stegosaurus, has teeth that are really designed for processing plant matter, not for fighting. Which is why they have other weapons. Horns in the case of bison, and tail spikes in the case of Stegosaurus. Wild herbivores are not docile cows. They can and will defend themselves. Moose attacks in the USA cause more casualties than bear attacks. Stegosaurus is not a good choice if the goal is safety.
Would you keep one as a pet?
I don't know if I have to have a big
yard?
Big fence.
Yeah, big fence.
Maybe, it's like kind of like raising a bison or a buffalo.
Yeah.
If they want to get out, they get out.
So what, you need a ranch? I mean, humans do farm bison. That's why on the 4th of July, I like to make a bison burger. The most American food that I can think of.
So if you'd have to almost have a brick wall around them.
Okay.
But I think, Stegosaurus would be pretty. They don't have big horns although I guess they have the spikes on their tail they could do some damage with if you made them mad.
Yeah.
Ah, there it is. Clarey remembered the most memorable thing about Stegosaurus.
But I think some of these dinosaurs would be really cool just to see walking around.
There, I think that Timothy Clarey and I are entirely on the same page.
See if we got them right. Did we get the renditions of these right?
So you're going for the safe factor, not the cool factor.
Right.
If that's what he's doing, then
You chose poorly.
Well, in his talks, I've heard him give Jack Horner, because I dug on his crew one year for a week up in Montana, and he said, "I'm glad they're extinct."
Yeah.
Because I want to walk around at night.
Yeah.
That was what he said. So
honestly, fair.
I agree. If these are fast-moving dinosaurs, although in a cooler climate they wouldn't be as fast.
Tell it to the Alaskan Tyrannosaurus Dinosaurus. Dinosaurs absolutely remained active in the cold of the Cretaceous Arctic. Granted, it was more like modern Alberta in climate than it was like modern Alaska. But still, I don't know if you know this, but it snows pretty regularly in Alberta. This is yet another reason we know that at least some non-avian dinosaurs were warm-blooded. They were active cold-weather animals.
So you got to keep in mind the pre-flood world was probably a global greenhouse.
If that were true, then we wouldn't have glacial terrain until the very top of the stratigraphic column, but that's not true. There are glacial deposits from the Mesozoic, which is during the flood for Clarey. Non-avian dinosaurs encountered snowfall, glaciers, and probably even sea ice on occasion. Now, the Mesozoic was much warmer than the current climate, something humans seem intent on changing, but that does not mean that there were no cold environments, and those environments had dinosaurs in them. Of course, I would also like to point out that it's essentially impossible to get glacial formations under a global flood, so the fact that we have such formations mean that there was no global flood at the time Clarey thinks there was one.
Mm-hmm.
And so the dinosaurs could always be active, even if they were cold-blooded, which I kind of think they were.
It really is starting to seem like the only reason he thinks dinosaurs were cold-blooded is that it makes it less plausible that birds are dinosaurs. All the evidence points in the opposite direction, although I'll admit it's not exactly conclusive. Yet here's Clarey just hand-waving away all the evidence, and the only excuse he has beyond that simple denial is that it's a difference that he thinks he can draw between birds and dinosaurs.
And so they were always active. But today, with cooler temperatures and stuff, they couldn't be as active maybe all the time, or if they had to stay near the equator where it was warmer pretty much all the time.
Even if that were true, it doesn't really explain the extinction. Large lizards, large turtles, and crocodilians are all cold-blooded, and they live only in the warmer regions of the world. But they still do fine in the modern world. They weren't driven to extinction. What about a Komodo dragon or a water monitor is special that allows them to persist that isn't true of, say, Buriolestes?
And so that's one of the reasons I do believe they went extinct after the flood, after they got off the ark, because they just couldn't exist in a lot of the world, especially when the Ice Age came on right after for maybe 500, 600, 700 years after the flood.
This is Megalania, the largest terrestrial lizard ever known to have existed. Why do we have what Clarey would identify as post-flood fossils of Megalania, but not, say, Megalosaurus? Was Megalania a lizard warm-blooded, even though all extant members of its family, and so presumably kind, are cold-blooded? You see, this is a big problem in creationism. So many of their ideas kind of make sense in isolation, but the instant you try to integrate them as part of a consistent view of the history and operation of the world, they fall apart. This is why there is no actual flood model. Every attempted flood model is full of contradictions, physical impossibilities, and unexplained phenomena. No model is perfect, but the models presented by science have actual explanatory power and are generally not internally contradictory.
So that kind of squeezed him into, and also forced him to live pretty close in proximity with humans.
Yeah, that might explain why dinosaurs other than birds didn't make it to the current day. But then, where are all the Holocene dinosaur fossils? We have other large quaternary reptile fossils like Megalania or Ningemis. Sure, maybe they were hunted to extinction. Perhaps the same is true for large mammals like Megaloceros, mammoths, Indricotheres, Brontotheres, etc. So where are the non-avian dinosaurs from the same post-flood times? There is no particular explanation for this.
And so a lot of humans were probably killing them off as well. You hear about these knights killing dragons. Those are probably small dinosaurs.
Or, they're just stories. Some stories just aren't true. Stories of dragons are not good evidence for late surviving non-avian dinosaurs. Instead, if we want to take those stories seriously, we should wait until there is physical evidence of their truth. Basically, creationists get this exactly backwards. The stories are not evidence of the dinosaurs. Actual dinosaur remains would be evidence of the stories. The same thing is true for the Trojan War. It was generally not accepted as historical until after the ruins of Troy were found. Physical evidence trumps stories. Stories need to be backed up by physical evidence, and unlikely stories should generally be treated with skepticism if there is no physical evidence. This is also why the criminal justice system does not simply rely on accusations to demonstrate guilt. An accusation is just a story about someone doing something bad. Evidence is needed, and eyewitness testimony, that is more stories, is the least reliable kind of evidence.
And to get the really big dinosaurs that we see in the museums, those are probably hundreds and hundreds of years old.
Yeah.
And that goes against conventional, evolutionary scientist wisdom as well. They think these dinosaurs grew fast and, within 40 years.
Yeah, because of histological studies where we can thin section long bones and determine with a high degree of confidence the age of the individual when they died or when they stopped growing. And we know it didn't take centuries for dinosaurs to get big. It took a few years in most cases. Again, this requires an extremely high metabolism since growth is energy intensive.
There's none that even live that long. They argue again to try to use bone structure in that, but after a while the bone structure doesn't leave your annual lines.
Right.
And so there's a point where you're just looking at a minimum age.
Yeah, but that point is after growth has stopped, or at least slowed, so it's true that even if we see an adult titanosaur femur, and it has, say, indications of being 12 years old, that means it's at least 12 years old, and I suppose it could actually be 112 years old, but it still means that it got to that size in 12 years, which is exactly what Clarey is trying to argue is not the case.
So I do believe these big, huge sauropods, these big, huge T-Rexes we see, they're 40 foot long, the sauropods are 100 feet long. I think those animals were probably 500, 600, 700 years old.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe, it seems pretty unlikely to me, but their size is not an indication of that. And we know for a fact that they got to be that size in years, not centuries. So this is all irrelevant. I'm also not sure what Clarey thinks the relevance is.
And
Killed in the flood.
Yeah,
probably.
Dr. Jake Hebert's working on that right now. He's working on some studies of scaling of animals in size and longevity. And he's got some really interesting research that's going to be coming out in the future on that.
Yeah.
I'm excited to see Dr. Forehead's new research on animal growth and longevity. I'm sure he won't do things like forget that indeterminate growers slow down their growth as they age, or that we don't have any evidence that most dinosaurs were indeterminate growers in the first place.
And we'll have him on to talk about that.
Be honest, Trey. The guy who's going to come on to talk about this work in longevity and ontogeny is probably going to be someone who specializes in rocks or space or something. From what I can tell, this show never seems to have on the person with the right academic background, despite ICR having such a person on staff. Even this talk would have been better suited for Brian Thomas, but it also would have been better if you had seen it sooner. You can by joining my Patreon. It's linked in the description, and also above if I don't forget. Videos are released on Patreon long before they are public, and you can also get access to a special super secret Discord server just for my supporters.
Okay.
He gets a little excited, though.
Yeah, he does.
Unlike me, I don't get as excited. But
Clarey sounds like the life of the party.
No,
Dr. Jake, he gets pretty excited about his research, and that's what's great about science. Is people get passionate about their science.
yeah, absolutely.
I'm passionate about my geology and passionate about dinosaurs.
While I do like that science can get people passionate about cool topics, I don't think that's the main cool thing about it. What I like most about it is that it works. Science can answer questions like, how do I send a robot to Mars? What is the safest form of energy production per unit of energy generated? It's by far nuclear, by the way. Or, where should I look for the fossil of an animal with some autapomorphies of tetrapods, but also many of the basal traits of stegocephalian fish? The problem is that all of science works, because the parts that don't stop being science. And evolution is currently working quite well. It's how we find fossils, it's how we develop vaccines, it's how we treat brain-eating infections. And in some cases, it's even how we design new products and write new computer code.
Let's chat about like the other kind of dinosaurs. So, briefly, so we're looking at dinosaur brains. We know that that evolutionists were like, oh, the theropod style dinosaurs become chickens, become birds.
Well, again, no, that seems to imply that broadly all the tetrapods separately moved toward a bird-like condition, but that is not true. Large taxa do not evolve together in the same way. That is because mutations are stochastic and contingent. Once two lineages separate such that they no longer have significant gene flow, mutations in one lineage will not make their way to the other, which further serves to make gene flow between them less likely, as many mutations may make them physically incapable of breeding or simply make them no longer see members of the other lineage as mating partners. Each lineage will have different mutations fixed, resulting in different phenotypes. The last common ancestor of all extant birds was a single species of dinosaur from the last bit of the early Cretaceous. No other dinosaurs ever evolved into birds, even though some, who were already very closely related, like Microraptor or Ornithomimus, convergently evolved some bird-like forms. Birds are dinosaurs, but no taxon larger than aves evolved as a group into modern birds. Perhaps this is nitpicking, Let me know in the comments. But I really feel like this phrasing is confusing, and I don't know if that confusion is intentional.
Do the brains of those theropod dinosaurs look different than the brains of these other dinosaurs?
Which other dinosaurs? There were a lot of non-theropod dinosaurs out there. Or I guess there were?
I don't know exactly. That's a good question, or I have to admit I don't know. But most of the other dinosaurs, their brains were smaller.
Right.
I know that much.
That's true.
So the theropods were the biggest?
You can plot, theropods were the biggest.
Okay.
They had the biggest brains of all dinosaurs. And it's because I believe they had to go out and search for prey.
Okay.
And
Well, Clarey thinks that that wasn't true before the fall. Why did theropods need bigger brains to hunt down plants? See, creationism can't figure out an internally consistent model. If you explain any feature of an organism with reference to design, it brings up the question of what the purpose of that design is before the fall. In many cases, such as venom, spines on plants, poison, or anatomy generally useful for carnivory, there is no good explanation. I've even heard creationists say that venom was originally made for nutrition because it has a lot of protein, as if in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve were sucking venom out of a scorpion tail or the heel of a platypus. On its own, design as an explanation for the anatomy of organisms can be at least internally consistent, but in the context of the theology of most young Earth creationists, it simply can't be internally consistent. Any design explanation for behaviors that are thought to be the result of the fall will not make sense as explanations for what is going on before the fall.
God knew that they would be eating each other, I think, and so he built in bigger brains in them.
So then the fall was intended by God. God set up the world for it beforehand. It's part of his plan. This means that according to this theology, God created thinking, feeling creatures, set them up for failure, which he knew was inevitable, and now he sends the majority of them to eternal conscious torment for doing what he planned for them to do anyway. Now, of course, this theology is far from the only way to do Christianity, but it's the way this group of Christians has opted to do it.
I think, knowing that was going to happen, that Adam and Eve was going to sin, because he knows everything. And so I think they do have bigger brains because they have to go search for food more so than just finding it, like just purely eating vegetation all the time.
So I guess now we can say that, yeah, carnivores were just malnourished before the fall, because they had bodies and biochemistry that were designed for meat, but they were forced to eat plants anyway. That seems rather cruel. Like vegan Gain starving his dog cruel. Hypercarnivores like Tyrannosaurus or tigers cannot survive on raw plant matter, and can only barely make it on cooked high-protein plant matter, and even then, often only with careful attention to amino acid balance. For instance, cats need a high taurine diet, or they will starve with a full belly.
And so I think that
Gonna have to have the good sense
that
of
reason,
smell.
they had a better sense of smell. I think that's the olfactory lobe looks pretty long, just like on a crocodile alligator.
That depends on the lineage. It's true for tyrannosaurs like Tyrannosaurus or Albertosaurus, but it's less true for most other dinosaurs. Dinosaurs, unlike most mammals, are visual creatures. They can see more wavelengths of light than mammals, at least among living dinosaurs, and their brains were wired to process a lot of visual stimulus. This remains true among living birds. Animals like T-Rex or vultures are the exception among dinosaurs, both in the Mesozoic and the Cenozoic.
And so they could smell probably better than you and I, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, but then humans have really bad senses of smell overall. Really, that's broadly true for primates, but humans are especially bad at it.
But there are definitely differences. Most of the dinosaurs had smaller brains to their body ratio than the theropods.
Yep, and then birds have even larger brains than other theropods. It's kind of like there's an evolutionary lineage.
Theropods, and I think the raptors, the Velociraptor and Deinonychus, had a bigger brain-to-body ratio than even the T-Rex.
Yeah, by a pretty good margin. And isn't it curious that Deinonychusauria, the group that contains troodons and dromaeosaurs, or the so-called raptors, is usually recovered as a sister group to Aviale, or birds in the broad sense? Indeed, some studies recover birds as nested within Deinonychusauria, as a sister group to troodontids. It's sort of like the more bird-like dinosaurs are transitional forms between basal dinosaurs like Tyrannosaurus and birds. No, it's exactly like that.
Okay.
But it still wasn't that big. It doesn't approach the bird-sized brain from what they can tell.
Not on average, but the largest non-avian theropod brains are as big as the smallest bird brains. We have all the relative sizes between Crow and Tyrannosaurus, either in fossils or in living organisms, or both.
And so that's what we need to look at more than the actual size is the ratio to the
Right.
body.
Yeah, obviously. An elephant has a much bigger brain than a human in absolute terms, but as a fraction of body weight, it's smaller. And while elephants are indeed very, very smart, they are not at human levels in terms of cognition.
because you're just scaling things up. And,
Okay.
and that's one of the things that Dr. Jake Hebert's working on is a scaling thing. And so
I'm sure that will be interesting, although I suspect it will be interesting in terms of what relevant data it ignores, since I can almost guarantee that, in line with the general creationist tendency to ignore about 90% of the data, Dr. Forehead will ignore a lot of data.
I don't really see, they plot up on these graphs. You can plot them up on log paper like engineers love to do. You get a straight line, and you get a bird line and you get a dinosaur line, and they're about an order of magnitude below each other, size for size.
Too bad we don't actually have any reference for that beyond a promise of future work from Megamind at home. When I went searching for such a study, the only thing that came up was a doctoral dissertation I don't have a way to access.
Across the board. And that's kind of the way it is with warm-blooded animals versus the cold-blooded animals. And the dinosaurs always seem to fall in that less brainy size.
Do they, though? No, they don't, because of course they don't. Some do, such as Diplodocus, whose brain is only 41% of the size expected for an average reptile of its size. On the other hand, the brain of Tyrannosaurus rex, estimated by taking the cranial endocast volume and reducing it by 50%, is 270% the size expected for an average reptile of its size. So it seems like even the small-brained theropods are outliers among reptiles for having larger brains. And unlike Clarey, who is citing work that hasn't been published and probably never will be published in a scientific journal, I am citing Using CT to Peer into the Past, a 3D visualization of the brain and ear regions of birds, crocodiles, and non-avian dinosaurs by Lawrence M. Whitmer et al., from the book Anatomical Imaging, published 2008.
But they were smart enough to do what they had to do.
Yeah.
They reproduced, they ate, and they ate their food that God provided for them through the vegetation, and even T-Rexes.
Yeah.
I think why they're finding distinctive layers in the rock record is because they were still living in the areas where their vegetation was.
Well, I guess Clarey thinks ecological zonation explains the ordering of fossils, which would be nice, if it worked as an explanation. The idea is that the higher layers in the stratigraphic column come from higher elevation ecosystems. But why are mosasaurs preserved much higher in the column than, say, Isanosaurus? With the mosasaurs being from the late Cretaceous and being marine organisms, but Isanosaurus being a sauropod from the early Jurassic, which is a terrestrial organism. Did mosasaurs just live in high elevation oceans? How does that even work? It doesn't.
The vegetation might have varied by elevation slightly. And so certain dinosaurs ate certain foods. They stayed near that food source. And that's why they were buried all over the world at about the same level. Then above that you see the T-Rexes or you see the raptors. They're eating maybe different things.
But that's just not true. We don't see any change in the paleoflora of the fossil record that shows any indication of being separated out by elevation. We don't see things like shallower roots and shorter trees in the Cretaceous due to its higher elevation. Indeed, the famous Hell Creek Formation is distinctly low elevation, being barely above sea level since it borders an actual sea, and it has low elevation deep-rooted tall trees, including Metasequoia, a tree which, while not as tall as the giant redwood in modern California, still in modern examples gets to 50 meters or so tall.
Eating whatever.
And maybe, being the theropods with a little bit bigger brain, they might have had a better reaction to the disaster of the flood coming upon them as well. They might have
and if
been
they
a little
moved
more
more
mobile.
quickly,
Might have been a little more mobile.
But this does not work either. Titanosaurus is known from the end of the Cretaceous. While I'm sure it could move, I wouldn't exactly consider it a likely speedster. On the other hand, Allosaurus is clearly built for speed, and it's from the late Jurassic, much lower. Why didn't Allosaurus get to run up the hill, but Titanosaurus did? Even worse, what about the pterosaurs? They can just fly to high elevations. Why are they so much more common in the Jurassic while declining through the Cretaceous, while all birds and stem birds are proliferating? It makes sense in terms of an old Earth and evolution, but pterosaurs break both ecological zonation and the running for the hills idea.
The Stegosaurus always gets insulted as having the smallest brain for its body size, and it did have a very small brain to body size.
Yep, unusually so, even for a dinosaur. That's why it used to be thought it had what amounted to a second brain near its hip. Turns out that's not true, but it was a fun thing to think about as a kid.
But it just had to stand there and eat food.
And there used to be the rumor of it that it had a brain in its back.
Oh, hey, yeah, I just mentioned that. Not sure I'd call it a rumor, but whatever.
But they found on some other animals that's probably just a fat storage spot. So it really didn't have a back brain and a front brain.
I just want to point out that Clarey keeps getting so quiet as to be barely audible, and I'm trying to fix that. How can the ICR afford a full-scale animatronic T-Rex, but not a proper mic setup for their podcast? If you want to help me someday get a full-size animatronic, or, maybe just a computer upgrade, feel free to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. It's free, it's reversible, and it helps the channel grow.
So there's a lot of things really fascinating about dinosaurs that if you keep up on them, there's a lot of new discoveries. There's some good science, but unfortunately it's all tainted with this evolution of making dinosaurs into birds now. I mean, they're really pushing that in the last.
Nope, no one is trying to turn dinosaurs into birds, not any more than anyone is trying to turn mammals into whales. Some dinosaurs are birds, some mammals are whales. I really cannot come up with a reason that creationists are so bad at this that doesn't either result in them being at the cognitive level that is routinely surpassed by 8-month-old babies, or them just being liars. If you have an alternate explanation, please let me know in the comments.
20 years, it's gotten really blatant.
Translation: scientists aren't shy about their conclusions, even the ones that Tim doesn't like. And how dare they?
Yeah.
And the movies now, the science is so bad. The last Jurassic World movie was so bad. We had a whole podcast on that.
Yeah, we went and watched that.
It was like, wow.
So easy to program your mind, because you guys watch TV like all the time. We control what you see on your TV, because we're a branch of the military. Yeah, we teamed up with those Disney guys. They help us propagate our lies.
You know, a feathered dinosaur jumping in the ice, swimming under the water. It's like you're pushing the limits of.
Of what? I haven't seen the film, but the scene he's talking about featured prominently in the marketing material, so I'm familiar with it. The animal in question is Pyroraptor. Pyroraptor is not a well-known animal, and I suspect it was chosen because of its name. It's not even clear what family the animal belonged to, with some finding it to be a dromaeosaur while others an unalagid. But it doesn't really matter. We know dromaeosaurs had feathers because we have fossils of their feathers in Microraptor and fossilized quill knobs in Velociraptor. Unalagids were even more bird-like than Microraptor, an animal that's so bird-like that these morons say it's just a bird. So there is no plausible reconstruction for Pyroraptor that does not include feathers. Indeed, the Jurassic Park version of Pyroraptor, which has it as a dromaeosaur, is actually not feathery enough to be realistic. It has a naked head and naked hands, the first of which is unlikely and the second of which is virtually impossible.
It wasn't even a good movie.
Yeah, the storyline wasn't all that good.
And that's largely why I haven't bothered to watch it. That seems to be the consensus on the film. Honestly, there is more than one and fewer than two good films in the Jurassic Park franchise. Also, the new films got rid of Stegosaurus' beak, and looking at that weird lip-mouthed Stegosaurus gives me psychic damage.
Okay. Well, I think that this is something that's important as I don't want to say kids, but you know, you're taught a certain thing in school, and I mean,
do another take, man. It's not that hard. Just stop, collect your thoughts, and try again. This isn't live. I do that all the time in these videos.
You watch Jurassic Park or you're taught something and then something comes out later that it changes, but you don't necessarily get alerted of that change, right?
Right.
I mean, yeah, it's the perennial problem of science communication. How to keep people up to date with new findings in the field, while also neither boring them with the technical minutiae that would take years of education for them to even understand, while still not lying about the findings by exaggerating them with clickbait headlines and hyperbolic articles or videos. Further, no matter how up-to-date a movie is in terms of science, science will always march on, and so those movies will be inaccurate. At one point, it seemed plausible that a cannon could shoot people to the moon, and so we have the 1902 film Le Voyage dans la Lune, in which people get to the moon by means of a giant cannon. Similarly, the Martians in The War of the Worlds in 1897, which was at the time more or less hard sci-fi, had Martians shot to Earth in a cannon. It turns out we now know that cannons are a really bad way to go to space. The projectile has no ability to capture into orbit or soft land, and the initial acceleration would be lethal to any passenger. But hey, that seemed reasonable back in the day. Similarly, in At the Mountains of Madness, a 1936 novella by H.P. Lovecraft, an intelligent alien species has wings that allow them to move through space by harnessing the ether, a thing we now know does not exist, but it was still believed in by many despite Einstein having already published his theory on general relativity. Depictions of science in media will always be out of date and go further out of date as time goes on.
And so you grow up believing this thing all the time, and you're like, wait a minute, what?
Yeah, like the dinosaurs were all cold-blooded and scaly. Turns out, that's not true. But it's also the thing Trey seems to be complaining about. Trey is against science because that's the only reason to complain about new media incorporating the latest scientific discoveries.
Yeah, and unfortunately now kids are kind of being brainwashed with dinosaurs are birds and dinosaurs had feathers and all this kind of stuff.
Jesus Christ, dinosaurs are not birds. Birds are dinosaurs. This isn't hard to figure out. Just like mammals aren't whales, but whales are mammals. The verb to be in English is not just an equal sign in mathematics. Things linked with it do not actually have to be the same thing. If I say a Dalmatian is a dog, I can't just reverse that like a math equation and say that a dog is a Dalmatian. As if every dog were a Dalmatian. There is no way Clarey is this stupid. He didn't get a PhD while being unable to understand this basic idea of sets within sets. This is a basic human thing, not some special scientist thing. The only thing I can think of is that he must be saying it intentionally to be confusing so that his audience thinks that the scientists are proposing that animals like Triceratops or Stegosaurus are birds, which no one has ever suggested.
And and some of my colleagues in the creation community are like, well, why couldn't God have made dinosaurs with feathers? And they actually will tell audiences that dinosaurs had feathers.
Yeah, they have a point. This is a thing that creationists get wrong for just no reason. I really don't get it. Just don't pretend no non-avian dinosaurs had feathers and stop pretending that birds aren't dinosaurs. It's not like whales being mammals broke creationism. Why should this?
But I think they're not looking carefully at all the data.
You serious?
Talk about projection.
They're not looking at the back hip.
No, they only look at the front hips, of course.
They're not looking at, is this a bird or is this a dinosaur?
Well, when it's an animal like Oviraptor or Microraptor, it's definitely not a bird, and it definitely has feathers. You know what? Just as a reminder, here are some dinosaurs that have feathers and are not birds. And even one of the evolutionary bird paleontologists. Ah yes, Alan Fiducia incoming. Hey, fun fact. The fact that someone doesn't reject evolution doesn't make them not a crank. Fiducia is a laughingstock who has no arguments left. He's flat wrong, and he would identify many of the animals that Clarey thinks are dinosaurs and not birds, including Pyroraptor, as flightless birds.
Who studied these things. He says almost all those dinosaurs with feathers that they're calling dinosaurs with feathers are actually just birds.
Mm-hmm.
But Clarey doesn't think that. Fiducia basically says that all Maniraptorans are birds. That includes Velociraptor, Therizinosaurus, and Oviraptor. So which is it? Is Pyroraptor in Jurassic World a dinosaur who shouldn't have feathers, as Clarey said, or is it a bird like Fiducia says? Clarey can't have it both ways. These are mutually incompatible ideas. The minimum I ask for from people's ideas is that they be at least internally consistent. When they're not, they aren't even really ideas. Guess what? Clarey's take on birds is internally inconsistent. Clarey doesn't even really have a definable idea about the taxonomy of birds and dinosaurs. He just knows he doesn't like what the data indicate to everyone who isn't willing to lie about them.
And so they're blurring the definition so much that nobody really knows the difference. And I think even some creationists are caught up in saying, well, these are dinosaurs and they did have feathers.
Here's a character-based definition for birds. Animals with a beak, feathers, fused metatarsal bones forming the tarsometatarsus, 3 digits in the manus that fuse into the carpometacarpus, as well as fused phalanges, and which have a tail ending in a picostyle. Here's a character-based definition for dinosaurs. Dinosaurs are animals with an open or extensively perforate acetabulum, 3 or more sacral vertebrae that are firmly attached to the sacral arches, an asymmetrical fourth trochanter of the femur, and a femoral head that is distinctly offset and angled from the shaft such that the femur does not project laterally from the animal, but rather primarily articulates in the sagittal plane. Now, both of these definitions could be expanded, but if you find an animal that fits either definition, you have a bird or a dinosaur. The problem is that birds meet the definition for a dinosaur. So no one is blurring the definition of either, and further, remember, Clarey hasn't bothered to give a definition at all. So near as I can tell, he doesn't even know what dinosaurs are or what birds are.
But are they really dinosaurs?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Other experts say they're birds,
Right, and if it's a bird, it also meets the definition for a dinosaur, and is a dinosaur. Just like if an animal is a whale, it also meets the definition for a mammal, and so is a mammal.
Even that particular fellow, he's being shouted down. He's being treated like a creationist in some ways because he doesn't go along with the mainstream science.
Yes, when you go against the evidence, you get ignored or laughed at. Doesn't matter if you're a flat earther, a creationist, or a guy who thinks that birds aren't dinosaurs. Take a mockable position, and you get mocked. That he is treated as a pariah isn't an argument that he's right.
And so he's, in his books, he writes about how he feels persecuted.
Mm-hmm.
Oh no, the poor guy. All he did was ignore evidence stubbornly for decades, and now he's not taken seriously. Yeah, he did that to himself, just like creationists do. That's just the consequence for their actions. Some things that people do aren't respectable. Things like attempting to steal an election, pretending that the Earth is more than 700,000 times younger than it is, or ignoring basically all data in paleontology in service of a dogma you simply choose to accept. Turns out, when you do those things, people tend not to respect you.
Because he doesn't believe what everybody else is supposed to believe. But
Nope, that's not why. Early on, when he still had viable arguments, he was still a fringe figure, but he was still reasonably well respected, because he had viable arguments. Now that he doesn't, but persists anyway, he has gone from a respectable but fringe worker to just a loon.
he says the data doesn't support it. And, he's a bird paleontologist.
Yeah.
He knows more about birds than the dinosaur paleontologists do.
Except that his specialty is Cenozoic birds, birds after the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs. He does not have expertise in late Jurassic or Cretaceous birds and paravians. I'm sure he knows a ton about the diversity of passerine ear bones, which he's published on, but he clearly knows next to nothing about theropods as a group. The point that he thinks that lots of animals Clarey correctly thinks are clearly and obviously theropods are not theropods and are instead birds should indicate to Clarey that Fiducia isn't someone Clarey should take seriously.
Could the creationists who are saying, well, why can't birds have feathers? Could that just be kind of like a capitulation? Just like.
Of course it is, but creationists capitulate all the time. They've capitulated on some common ancestry, on natural selection, etc. This is just a capitulation, and it'll just keep spreading. Creationists always find themselves in a game of figuring out how to accommodate scientific conclusions that are so obviously true that they cannot continue to plausibly deny them, even to their own misguided audiences. Birds being dinosaurs is a relatively new conclusion in science, for creationists, and so I'm sure we're a few decades away from creationists accepting it broadly, and then trying to gaslight us about ever having rejected it, and even claiming that they predicted it all along. One way in which it's good to capitulate is to capitulate to joining the channel, with the join button below this video. You get access to cool channel emojis, a channel badge, your name turns green in live chats and the comments to let people know you support me, and you get early access to videos like this, as well as access to the super secret Discord server just for my channel members and patrons.
An area of, we're compromising here.
Well, I don't know if there, I don't think there may be, I don't know.
You can't speak for them.
Well, I don't know. Yeah, I wonder why they're going along with that. Is it just to fit in more with mainstream science?
No, because they don't fit in with mainstream science. They're young Earth creationists. They're wrong about most of science by like 6 orders of magnitude. Reversing course on one minor and particularly obvious scientific error isn't going to make these creationists any more accepted in science. Just like if a flat earther decided to stop denying the 24-hour sunlight at extreme Antarctic latitudes, they wouldn't suddenly be welcomed into the halls of academia alongside people who aren't wrong about the shape of the Earth. Young Earth creationism isn't a scientific position. It's a conspiracy theory that, if true, would require virtually all scientists to be in on the conspiracy, and which would require fundamental aspects of essentially every branch of science to be completely wrong, from physics to biology to astronomy, etc. When your basic position has about the same level of plausibility as the position that the moon is made out of glass that was dug out of the Grand Canyon by giants to mock humans for worshipping the sun, conceding some minor point that you previously got wrong isn't really going to help. Young Earth creationism is physically impossible, internally incoherent, and useless scientifically. Nothing short of abandoning it is going to help. There is no saving it. There is no softening it. It is fundamentally just not true. There is no option where it is vindicated and its adherents are welcomed into the scientific discourse with open arms. So no, I don't think that people like Matt McLean are going to become more acceptable to the scientific community for getting it right that some dinosaurs were not birds, but had feathers. All that being said, I guess maybe Matt McLean and his pals are so delusional that they think they will actually become accepted by actual scientists. I don't know. I don't like to think that Matt is quite that silly, but then again, he is silly enough to be a young Earth creationist in the first place, so who knows?
Because to me, I've tried to look at the data.
Yeah, I really don't think he has.
I tried to look at, I read a lot of different things, and that's like when I tried to prepare my lab book for my students years ago when I was a college professor on dinosaurs. just do an introductory dinosaur class, but I needed some sort of lab. I tried to look at both sides of the issue.
There aren't two sides to this issue. Some animals that do not meet the definition for birds, but do meet the definition for dinosaurs, have clearly preserved unambiguous feathers. Birds also meet the definition for being dinosaurs. It's like saying you want to teach both sides of the oxygen theory and the phlogiston theory, or both sides of the Pythagorean theory versus made-up perspective. Or maybe we should make sure we teach about both the German side on the one hand and the Jewish and Romani side concerning World War II. Some things don't have two sides. Some things have one side and a bunch of deniers. There's a reason we don't call Holocaust deniers historians with non-mainstream conclusions. There's a reason we don't teach flat earth in school. There's a reason we teach firefighters about oxygen and not phlogiston. It's not because of bias, it's because sometimes there are no other options than the ones we know to be correct. The earth isn't flat, the earth isn't young, fire needs oxygen, phlogiston isn't a thing, and the Holocaust happened and some 11 million people died in it. Species share common ancestry, and the earth is billions, not thousands of years old. And yes, I am in fact equating Holocaust denialism, flat earth, and young earth creationism. All of them are equally wrong, and all of them are dangerous ideas that have and will get people killed, either directly or indirectly.
If you get away from what's being shoved down everybody's throat,
Hey, some people are into that kind of thing. It's okay.
all you get is one view. Mm-hmm. And I think these guys are only reading that one view. They're not looking, is there an alternative explanation? Is there other people that are saying and critically analyzing this?
No, there aren't. There are people looking at the evidence and coming to the conclusion that many non-avian dinosaurs had feathers, and then there are dogmatic and dishonest people ignoring data and lying about that data to pretend that it's not true. That wasn't necessarily the case 30 years ago, when you could still have some good faith arguments on the subject, but that time has passed.
So I don't know if they're not, I think they're just looking at the mainstream view and saying, well,
The mainstream view is the mainstream view specifically because it is the view supported by the evidence. Sure, it might be wrong, but that won't be discovered until we get new evidence. And at this point, the evidence is so strong and coming from so many places that such evidence of the view being wrong is extremely unlikely to show up. Science is not a revealed religion. Its conclusions are not based on the prognostication of prophets and oracles. It has no sacred doctrines. The mainstream view in science is the best supported view, and it changes as new evidence comes in. Being currently well supported doesn't guarantee that an idea is true, but it's far more likely to be true than someone's cockamamie interpretation of an Iron Age creation story with no evidence besides the story itself, and literal mountains of evidence precluding the story.
okay, God created these things. He created some with feathers and some without.
Right.
They're not saying that dinosaurs evolved into birds, but I think, it's kind of iffy if you start putting feathers on them, then you're basically saying that dinosaurs are very bird-like.
Yeah, and if you put starting mammary glands on mammals, then you're starting to admit that many mammals are whale-like, because we know they have mammary glands. We can't have that now, can we?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think the evidence really supports it. There's a lot of evidence that's never talked about by these few naysayers, even in the evolutionary community, that say dinosaurs were cold-blooded. The evidence supports that.
Nope, both bone histology and examination of inferred behavior based both on ichnofossils and the anatomy of dinosaurs indicates that many were mesothermic or even endothermic. Sorry.
Dinosaurs didn't have feathers, that those are actually birds that have feathers, that you're looking at, extinct birds with bony tails.
And the brains
they're
are
still
completely
birds.
different.
But yeah, and they're not looking at the brain size. The brains are completely different shaped and size. And so
It wasn't true earlier, and it's not true now. But even if it were, why would it matter? Clarey would just continue on complaining because the thing is, nothing about this is based on evidence. You can tell because the evidence is already more than sufficient. No amount of evidence will ever be enough because young Earth creationism isn't about evidence. At least not for people as deep in it as Clarey. For some of the lay people, it is about evidence. That's why people like myself, Bent, Vishanti, Gutsick Gibbon, Dr. Zach Hancock, and Dr. Mary Schweitzer left young Earth creationism. For us, it was about the evidence. And for parts of our lives, we all honestly thought that creationism had the evidence, because we had all of us been deceived. For another ring was made, in the land of Mordor, in the fires of Mount Doom. The Dark Lord Sauron forged in secret a master ring to control all others, and into this ring he poured his cruelty, his malice, and his will to dominate all life. Oh, wait, no, that's a different thing. But yeah, it was people like Timothy Clarey, Kent Hovind, Carl Baugh, Ken Ham, etc. who lied to us. The professionals may be immune to evidence, but the majority of young Earth creationists have just ended up being duped by people who tricked them into thinking they were trustworthy.
the real dinosaurs.
Oh, great. Christians already spend enough time telling each other that they're not true Christians. Now he's going to do it to dinosaurs, too. As a side note, he still hasn't actually defined either bird or dinosaur.
Had nothing like a bird brain.
Okay.
Real dinosaurs didn't have feathers, just like T-Rex didn't have feathers.
Okay.
But how does he know that? The same way that he can figure out which skulls are humans and which are apes. He just kind of does it by vibes. Archaeopteryx passes the vibe check, so it's a bird. Microraptor passes the vibe check, so it's a bird. Velociraptor, despite being in the same subfamily as Microraptor, fails the vibe check, so it's a dinosaur. Homo erectus passes the vibe check, so it's human. Australopithecus sediba doesn't, so it's just an ape.
That's it. That's the definitive answer.
Well,
We got it from Dr.
again,
Clarey himself.
if there's more data that comes out and shows it, if you find a dinosaur, a true dinosaur, not something that's ambiguous.
Remember, this is an unambiguous dinosaur skeleton, and this is an unambiguous bird and not a dinosaur skeleton, according to Clarey here at least. I don't know how much less different these two could be. These are both very unambiguously dinosaurs, but then again, so are sparrows and crows and parrots.
Right.
Some people will say this and this and this. If you find something that's a true dinosaur, like a Stegosaurus, or if you find a...
Stegosaurus is as far from being a bird as you can be while being a dinosaur. I don't expect it to ever be found with bird-like pelage. But what do you think makes Stegosaurus a dinosaur, but Microraptor not, according to Clarey? What unifying characteristics does he know about for Dinosauria? There is no answer.
And when they looked at T-Rex, they didn't find it. They found scaly skin.
Is T-Rex an unambiguous dinosaur? How do we know? This is very frustrating. If you want to argue contra the consensus that Group A is not a part of Group B, you have to start with defining both. Creationists never even bother. Well, I guess I can't say never. I have seen Bodhi Hodge try to do it, but it's very rare. And when Bodhi Hodge did try, the definition he gave for dinosaur was so bad that many non-dinosaurs like Lagasucids or Scleromoclids would have counted as dinosaurs according to him. This isn't complex rhetoric or anything. This is just basic human reasoning.
You can find scaly skin imprints of dinosaurs all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, because many dinosaurs did not have feathers, but that does not mean that the feathers you find suddenly cease to exist.
Well, if new data does come out, we'll reshoot this podcast.
That's right.
We'll have a follow-up.
We'll trash this one.
Yeah, no.
And we'll start over and say, Clarey was wrong.
Yeah.
I'll be the first to admit it.
Yeah.
No, he won't, because the evidence is already here. This is just like when a flurf says that they're open to the globe evidence and then just deny what their own eyes are showing them.
Today, I haven't seen anything definitive that tells me that this is a feathered dinosaur. I see. I agree more with Alan Fiducia, who's the evolutionary paleontologist.
No, he doesn't. He, in this very talk, has taken positions on Maniraptorans that are at complete odds with Fiducia. Plus, Fiducia thinks that birds evolved from dinosaur-like archosaurs. He doesn't think that birds aren't reptiles. He agrees in principle with the very thing about birds that Clarey objects to, that they evolved from reptilian ancestors that were not themselves birds. He would count Archaeopteryx as a transitional form just as much as anyone who is right about birds and dinosaurs.
That these are feathered birds
Okay.
with bony tails, just like Archaeopteryx.
Okay.
I would argue that any animal without a picostyle isn't a bird, since that's a common trait to all extant birds, and the class Aves was defined solely in reference to living birds. But either way, both modern birds and Archaeopteryx are dinosaurs. Calling it a bird doesn't help.
Well, any final thoughts before we draw this to a close?
Yeah, this whole podcast has been a waste. ICR had one job, to define what a bird is and what a dinosaur is, and show why birds don't meet the definition for dinosaurs. They didn't even try. Instead, they just showed us how much like a flat earther or Holocaust denier they are.
Dinosaurs were not bird brains.
But Clarey sure is.
All right, there you go.
That's my final thought.
That's your final thought.
They were
That's
crocodile brains. They were
crocodile
alligator
brains.
Nope, they're not that either. They're all archosaur-brained, and many, but not all modern birds have big brains. They have all the same parts across the board in their brains and in the same order. But that's it. That's the last actual claim. I've responded to creationists arguing that birds aren't dinosaurs more times than I can remember now. Hell, that's how the channel got off the ground, me debating Kent Hovind on this very topic. I've covered Bodie Hodge making this argument, Gabriella Haynes, David Menton, Brian Thomas, and Timothy Clarey twice now. Every time they fundamentally refuse to understand very basic logic, and refuse to even attempt to actually even format their arguments in a way that could show that they're correct. They don't even try. It might be that it's a personal topic for me, but I feel like they try even less on this topic than normal. Oh well. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like and tell me what you liked in the comments. If you didn't like it, then hit dislike and tell me what the problem was. Either way, please subscribe if you haven't and turn on all notifications so that occasionally YouTube might tell you about my content if they feel like it, regardless of your wishes. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Hey, before you leave, I just want to take a second to thank my patrons and channel members, especially those pledging $20 or above. Bent Hovind, Thoravara, Tapioca Weasel, Whispers, Eleron Teller, Horseflesh, Ian Chen, Kelvin Brostek Van Manen, Landed Knoll, Mabdy Babdy, Sphincter of Doom, Wallace, John Ackerman, and Strawberry Vein. It's because of my channel members and patrons whom you're seeing on screen that this channel can stay afloat. Without you, it would all shut down. If you want to join the team, there's a link to join the channel below this video, and there's a link to join the Patreon in the description. On the Patreon, you can get a 10% discount for pledging annually, and either way, you get early access to virtually all of my scripted videos, often 3 to 5 months before they come out for the general public. Thanks for watching.